Today I'm going to show you how you can run a Blazor WebAssembly application inside of Docker. And I'm also going to show you how you can set up your application and the Docker container so that it will correctly serve the right app settings file based on which environment you're in. For example, it should only serve local if you're on localhost, it should only serve dev if you're in dev, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. So I'm going to create a brand new Blazor app. I'm going to call it Blazor Demo. I'm going to use version 7, and it's very important that you choose Blazor WebAssembly app and not server app for this demo. I'll go ahead and click create. So in order for this to work, there are two important files that we need to add. The first is a Dockerfile. We need that Dockerfile so that we can tell Docker how to build our image so that we can use that image to run a container with our application inside of it. And then second, we need a way to host this. We need a way to serve up these files to anyone who makes requests to our website. In this example, I'm going to use Nginx, but you can use any web hosting application that you would like. So first, I'm going to start with the Nginx config file. So I'm going to switch this over to show the file system. You generally want to put these two files in the root of your project. So I'm going to say add a new file. This will be nginx.conf, and I'll just go ahead and add the Docker file here, and then we'll come back and fill it in later. Okay, so in our Nginx config file, I'm going to just go ahead and copy this in from my cheat sheet, and I'll just go through it line by line. First thing that we're going to do is we're just going to tell Nginx to include all of its MIME types, and then we're going to tell it to listen on port 8080. And generally this port number will be either 80 or 8080, but it could be different depending on how you host your application. So if you're hosting this in the cloud or on some other platform that uses a port besides 80 or 8080, make sure you change that here. Then I'm going to say the server name is localhost, and then I'm going to tell it that the root of our site, where all the static files are going to be, is going to be in the folder user/share/nginx/html. And then we tell it that the index file is index.html. And this last section with location and try files. And so this first URI here means, does that file exist? And if so, then serve up that file. If it doesn't exist, is it a folder? And if that exists, then serve that up. And then lastly, if none of those match, it's going to fall back to index.html. And in our Blazor app, you can see over here, if you look in the www root, index.html is the default page for Blazor. And since it's a single page application, all the requests will be routed through index.html, and then the Blazor routing will take over after that. That's all we should need to do for the index.html page, so let's go ahead and move on to the Docker file. And again, I'm just going to copy this in from my cheat sheet because there's quite a bit here, and I'll just go through it line by line. So first, we're going to start from a base image, and that base image is the .NET SDK, and I'm using version 7. If you're using a version besides 7, make sure you use the correct version here. And I'm going to refer to this stage of this Docker file as build, and that's because we'll need to reference this later on. And then I set the working directory to app, and then I copy over the solution file and the project file. After those are copied, I run a .NET restore. So .NET restore is just going to run NuGet restore. Then after that restore is done, we copy over all the rest of the files, and then we run a .NET publish. And we're going to build it in the release configuration, so it's not building in the debug config. And then -o is the output. And so I'm telling it to output to a folder called out. And then the last section of this Docker file is all for Nginx. And so the .NET publish command is going to build and compile our application so it's ready to serve. And then Nginx is going to do the actual serving of this application. And so I'm going to start from the base image of Nginx. I'm going to use version 1.23. The working directory is app. I'm exposing port 8080. This port needs to match the port that you use in your Nginx config file, which is this one here. And then I'm copying over the Nginx config file that we created earlier into the folder etc and Nginx. And then lastly, we need to take the output from our .NET build and put it into a folder where Nginx knows where to serve it from. That's what this last line does. So it's saying from build, and this means reference the build stage up here. We're copying everything from the app out www root folder into the user share Nginx HTML folder. And this path is coming from up here in this previous stage. So the working directory is app, which is the first part here. And then in our .NET publish, we told it to put it in a folder called out, which is this folder here. And then we need everything inside of www root, which is this folder here. And then .NET publish will also put a few more files in this folder when it does the build. And then lastly, this is the folder we copy it to so that Nginx knows where it is. And this folder here needs to match the folder that we put in Nginx right here in the root. So now everything should be all set up and ready to go. So let's go ahead and we will build this image and then run it and just make sure that everything's working correctly. So I'm going to open up the terminal. This is the terminal that's inside of JetBrains Writer, but you can use any terminal that you want. Just make sure that you're in the root folder of where your project lives. So I'll just do a quick ls You can see this is the root, there's the Blazor demo folder and the solution and my Dockerfile and the Nginx config file. And so the command to build this image is docker build, and I'm gonna say -t, which is for tag. I'm gonna call it Blazor demo, and then period just means run the Dockerfile in the current working directory. So I'll go ahead and run that. And then once that build is complete, we can go ahead and run the container. And that command is docker run. I'm going to give it a name, which will just be Blazor demo, which is the same name as the image that we just created. And I'll use -d, which means run it in detached mode. And then we need to map our ports. On the host, I'm just going to use port 5002. And then inside the container, this needs to go to port 8080. Again, that needs to match what you use here and in your Nginx config file. I'm going to pass one more command, which is --rm, and that just means remove. So when you stop this container, it's going to automatically remove the container as well. And it just makes it a little bit quicker when you're just debugging and stuff like that. And then lastly, we give it the name of the image, which is Blazor demo. So now if you go over to Chrome and you go to localhost port 5002, so this is the default app that Blazor gave us. So this just proves that our Docker container is running and it's working correctly. So this here is pretty great when you're just running locally and testing a few things. But when you're getting ready to deploy this and you need to go to a dev environment or a test environment, what we have here is not going to work. There are a couple different ways that you can tell Blazor what the current environment is. And so I'll put a link to this down below, but this is the documentation site from Microsoft on how to do this. So the first way, which I'm not going to actually go into a lot of detail and show how it works because it's actually pretty straightforward in how you do it, is you add a JavaScript script tag inside of your index.html file, and you set the environment depending on what the current host name is. And so just really quick, I can show you kind of what that looks like. So if I go back into the app, and I go into my index page, you can see right here is that script it was just referencing where it pulls in the webassembly.js script. If you add a new script tag, it just goes right below that. Now, one thing you do need to add, which is very important, is this auto start. So by default, Blazor will automatically start the application for you unless you tell it not to. And so this says, don't start the application automatically. I'm going to tell you when to start. And that's what this is doing right here. You can add a couple more if statements in here. So you can have one for localhost, you can have one for dev, you can have one for test. And then lastly, you can have your production URL. And that will set the Blazor environment for you. And so there's pros and cons to doing it this way. One of the pros would be that you can build the image once, and then you can use that same image to go to dev, test, and prod. That's kind of a common way of doing things in the DevOps world where you're not rebuilding it for each environment, which could potentially introduce new bugs that may not have been tested in the previous stages. However, one of the downsides is that you're setting the environment on the client side. And anyone who's worked with JavaScript on the client side knows that it is possible for this to be tampered with. Probably won't happen, so it's probably not a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. And the second way to set the environment variable is using a header. And in this example here, you can see that Microsoft, obviously, they're showing how to do it in IIS. And so I'm going to show you how you can do this in Nginx. And so the advantage of this is that you're setting this header on your server. So when the application is requested, this header is going to come from your server, and so it can never be changed. So let's hop into our app. We'll make a couple small changes to our app settings file so we can kind of make sure that we're using the correct environment variable, and then we'll get this set up. We're back in our project now, and I'm going to add a couple app settings files. So I'm going to create one file that is just appsettings.json. And inside of it, I'm going to put in an env name variable with a value of none. And then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to call this .development.json. And then I'll copy that again, and this one will be production. And inside the development file, this will be dev. And inside the production file, this will be prod. Then what I want to do is I want to go to pages, and on this index page, I want to just have it spit out the current environment is, and then we're going to pull that name from those app settings files so that we can see that when we change that header, it actually changes which app settings file is being used. I'm going to add a code block here. I'm going to inject the iConfiguration. Then I want to declare a variable where we can store that environment name. And then lastly, I'm going to set up the onInitialized method, and I'm going to pull the env name out of the app settings file, and I'm going to assign it to env name. And then very lastly, I'm going to say the current environment is env name. I'm going to actually run this without using Docker. I'm just going to run it from debug mode inside of JetBrains Writer. What I want to show you really quick is if you go to the launch settings.json file, you can see here it actually sets this ASP.NET Core environment variable for you. You actually can't set this environment variable on your server. It won't work. I'm actually not really sure how it does work when it's running from JetBrains Writer or Visual Studio. So if somebody knows, let me know. I'd love to know how this works. Just really quick, I just want to make sure that this is working locally first. So if I run this in development mode, so I just ran this and it actually didn't work. And the reason is I had this script tag in here from earlier when I was just kind of showing a quick demo of how that works. So make sure you take that script tag out and also remove that auto start. So now this should show that it's working. Okay, there we go. So now it's working. So you can see here, the current environment is dev. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop that. I'm just gonna go into launch settings. So I'm gonna change that to be production. We'll just run that and make sure that it shows prod as the name, which it does. This means it's pulling the correct names out of the app settings files for us. So now what we need to do is we need to tell Nginx that when it's going to serve up our files for our application, that it needs to include that header. And so in here, you can say add header, and then you give it the name. So it's Blazor-environment, and then you give it the value that you want it to be. And in our case, it's going to be either development or production. But in our situation, we actually want to change this depending on what we're going to build it for. And so I'll show you the way that I do it. I'd love to hear if there's other ways that people are doing this that's maybe a little bit cleaner. But what I do is I just put a placeholder in here. And I just call it replace me. And the way that we replace that value in that header is in our Dockerfile when we're doing the build. And so we need to know what environment we're going to build it for. And then we need to actually go in and replace that value. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add an environment argument. And we're going to pass this in during the build on whether this is going to be for, in our case, development or production. And then lastly, we need to actually go and replace that value. And since we're using Nginx and it was built on the Alpine OS, we can actually use Linux commands to go in and replace that value. And so I'm going to go ahead and just copy that in from my cheat sheet again, and I'll go over this. So we're going to use a tool called sed, which is a Linux tool for finding and replacing text inside of files. And sed, I believe, stands for stream edit. And so this -i means that we're going to actually just edit this file. And this command is telling sed what to go find and what to replace it with. So in our case, we want it to go find replace me in that file. And since we know that replace me is the only occurrence of that text in that file, that this is pretty safe to do this. So we're going to say replace the replace me text with our environment. So if we pass in development, it'll be development. If we pass in production, it'll be production. And then lastly, we tell it what file to go search for and replace this text in, which is the Nginx config file. Now we can go ahead and save this, and then we can go rebuild our image and make sure this is working. The command is pretty much the same as before. The only difference is now we need to pass in that build argument. So we need to say --build-arg. Our argument name was environment, and then the value we want to use for this is development. So we'll run that, and then we'll run the container. And the command to run this is the exact same run command we used earlier. So docker run. So now if I come into localhost 5002 and I refresh, you can see here, the current environment is dev. And I want to show one other way that you can confirm that this header is getting assigned correctly. If you go into your development tools in your browser, I'm currently using Chrome, and you refresh the page into your network tab. If you go view any of these files that were requested from your server, you can see here that the Blazor environment is being added and the value is development. And so this will be on every single one of these files. So let's go ahead and we'll stop this container. I'll rebuild this using production, and we'll just make sure that that works. Here's my build command. I'm going to just change this to production. Then I'll run the container again. And I'll go back into Chrome, refresh. Now you can see here that the environment variable is prod. And then just to triple confirm that, we'll go into our network tab and development tools. And you can see here, Blazor environment is production. Now that's all set up and working, and that's how you would change the environment using the environment header. And you can see there's definitely pros and cons to this as well. The pros being that the environment variable is being set on the server, which can never change. And of course, one of the cons being that you have to rebuild that Docker container every time you want to deploy to a new environment. It's not always a bad thing doing that. As long as you are using source control correctly, you know that your branches haven't changed from the different deployments, you shouldn't have any problems. But that's just one thing to keep in mind moving forward. I hope you all found this video useful. Like I said in my introduction, this is how I do my deployments. I would love to hear if there's other ways that people are doing this. And so if you are doing this in a different way, please let me know in the comments down below. If there's something I didn't do correctly or something that I should have done a little bit different, please let me know. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. And thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.